Hello, all, and welcome to Bennis Stories, a series of interviews with people who knew, loved, were influenced by, worked with, wrote with, were students and mentees of Warren Bennis. This is Kate Bennis, Warren's daughter. This series is created for the Warren Bennis Leadership Institute at the University of Cincinnati's Lindner College of Business. My partner in this endeavor is Betsy Myers. Betsy was a dear friend and colleague of Dad's, worked with him at the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government as its executive director. She has also been a senior advisor to both President Clinton and President Obama, and is a senior advisor to the Warren Bennis Leadership Institute. Today, Betsy and I are delighted to welcome Tom Peters. Tom is a dear friend and colleague of Dad's, and he also happens to be one of my favorite people. If Dad was optimistic beyond reason, Tom is enthusiastic beyond compare. Tom is co-author of In Search of Excellence, often tagged as the best business book ever. 20 books and 40 years later, Tom is still on the forefront of the management guru industry. As CNN said, while most business gurus milk the same mantra for all it's worth, the one-man brand called Tom Peters is still reinventing himself. His most recent effort with co-author Nancy Green is Tom Peters' Compact Guide to Excellence. Tom's tireless focus is on putting people first and developing leaders who stay in intimate touch with the frontliners who do the real work. In November 2017, Tom received the Thinkers 50 Lifetime Achievement Award. And at the end of his website bio, Tom has this: Warren Bennis, University of Southern California, the top scholar on the topic of leadership. Quote, I suppose the most significant contribution Tom has made to the management thought is his capacity to articulate in graphic and persuasive terms what it is that organizations and managers must do if they want to create successful human communities and also make a profit. He put into words what a lot of people had been talking about but never took all that seriously. And he writes with unbridled lucidity. If Peter Drucker invented management, Tom Peters vivified it. He goosed us all, managers and academics alike. One last thought, Tom is a dreamer. And thank God, a dreamer who can put his thoughts into clear and radiant terms. For a dreamer, said Oscar Wilde, is one who can find his way by moonlight and see the dawn before the rest of the world. So that's Dad's feelings about Tom and mine too. So welcome, Tom.
Hello, how are you? Good to see you.
So good to see you.
Bring anybody with you?
There's Betsy.
Oh, Betsy. I remember her.
Hi, Tom. You look very good.
So we're so excited that you can do this. This, as we were just talking about, is really so that the students at University of Cincinnati, the professors, anybody who's interested, I mean, these will be publicly available, can have access to conversations with people who knew Dad really well. And in some cases just knew his work. But in this case, both his work and you guys were friends. So I think we just wanted to start with, how did you meet Dad? And what was that like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Want to start that way right this minute?
Let's start. How'd you meet Dad?
Well, I, as usual, won't do exactly what I was told. I had some significant success, and when I retired, we had some retirement letters, and they said, you brought people back into organizations. And my response would be, yeah, I stole it from Warren. I stole it from Doug McGregor and people like that. I meet your father. Actually, it's the craziest thing in the world. My first book, of course, went bonkers. And people said, oh, we've seen him walk on water. And then, as is always the case, the shit hit the fan. And I remember Warren called me out of the blue. He didn't know me. And he said, welcome to the club. They love to build you up, and then they like to kick you just as hard as they pushed you on the way up. And as you can imagine, that was a great way to start a first conversation.
Wait, seriously, then, he just reached out to you out of the blue?
He just reached out.
Aww.
How the hell it occurred to him, I don't know. But it was honest to God. That's on top 10 sweet things of all time, which makes it, of course, very, very, very Warrenish. Who was it, that thing at the Kennedy School? Who's the actor? Oh, come on, the actress.
Glenn Close. Glenn Close.
Glenn Close. When I was doing my little talk, and Betsy was there too at Glenn Close with that group, I made a comment. Somebody said something, and I said, "Well, we're unbelievably delighted by the sorts of things that you can do." But I said, out here in this audience is Bill George. And both Warren and I depend on his pacemaker as well. It's probably kind of a little crappy thing to say, but what have you. But how did I meet Warren is obviously 1970 when I went to the Stanford Business School. And I, because of strange things that are not part of this conversation, ended up focusing on the people side of it. And, I've always been an inveterate reader X10, and I tripped over Warren. And between Warren and Doug McGregor, it was as if I had found another universe. You're talking about a kid who was a math valedictorian, who had 2 engineering degrees from Cornell, who had 2 business degrees from Stanford. I didn't even know what a human being was, for God's sakes. Then I got this incredible, fantastic, amazing supervisor the very beginning of my Stanford MBA career, and started reading this stuff. And I know it's a stupid statement and it's not a true statement, but I said, holy shit, there are people in organizations. Of course, the thing that does make Warren cry up above, and me too, 2023, I do a retirement letter, and all the people say these incredibly wonderful things, and they say, oh, you brought people back into organizations. I mean, holy shit. And both of you guys know this at least as well as I do, or 10 times better than I do. But the main thing was we ran into each other here, we ran into each other there, but saw his face a million times. And he was one of 2 or 3 people, along with that thesis advisor, who were just, I won't do any angel crap or anything like that, but who were hanging up there. And when somebody would beat the crap out of me for something or other, I would think, Warren, how'd I do? He said, don't pay attention to that. And I almost never use words like this. It's a lot more spiritual than technical.
So Tom, talk about your book, In Search of Excellence. Because when you wrote that book, you hadn't met Warren yet.
No.
And people said that your book was so important to bringing people back into organizations. So talk about that journey of your book and how, when it was such a huge success, were you surprised by that? And then tell us what happened. What was the people poking at it? Your whole journey of that book.
Yeah, well, one thing I am required to say by my own trademark when asked a question like that, I am more than willing to acknowledge it was a damn good book. The last 98% was timing. I have said, when you run into some arrogant SOB, I've said time and again, the 3 things I hate most in the world are spouse abusers, child abusers, and successful people who think they deserve their success. And the reason I bring that up in the case of this, you could do all the little stuff about what happened to you as a kid, but the United States came out of World War II and we owned the planet. And then in the 70s, we started to see these cars with funny names. And then people like Richard Pascal and Tony Athos started writing books about how to manage like the Japanese managers. And through a whole lot of other things that we don't have time to talk about, I was handed a project at McKinsey, and it was a wonderful kind of thing. And the McKinsey boss said, listen, we designed the smartest strategies that have ever been designed in the history of humankind, and people can't execute. What's going on? And so Bob Waterman and I said, yeah, well, everything is turning to shit around us, but there are a bunch of companies that are really doing it well. And we're going to go out and find them. And we traveled all over the world with American companies, ended up with 43. And I got a call right before the book was released from Ronald Reagan the day before. And he said, this is going to be good for you. We're going to announce 10% unemployment tomorrow. Of course, that's total bullshit, but the timing was perfect. We were getting the crap beaten out of us. Nobody was at work. And suddenly this book came along. I think there was some chapter or something that was called The Saving Remnant. And it was a book it was about ordinary people. The one I kind of remember most was a Toledo, Ohio-based company called the Dana Corporation, which makes automobile parts. And yeah, it's great to talk to IBM and all that kind of crap. But with Dana, it was real people in real factories in Toledo, and a boss who would die for them, and mainly cared about them getting ahead. And it was, I know it sounds so ridiculously simplistic, but it was a continual bag of holy shit moments, and it's gone from there. And I mean, the only problem is, and I implied this a little while ago, is I would like to think that it's done a lot of good, and maybe it has, but the people are short thing in the age of Milton Friedman and private equity. I'm sad to say things ain't gotten better. I've just one other little story. I can't help little stories. I was teaching in an executive program at Stanford, and I met this guy as a 40-odd-year-old at General Motors, and we were out having a beer at the end of the course. And he said, "Tom, you were terrific, but it really wasn't that important." I said, "Okay, I can handle that." He said, this was in Palo Alto, when I would pull up to a stoplight and stop, I'd look to my left and there would be a Toyota. I would look to my right and there would be a Honda. And I'd look ahead of me and there would be a Nissan. He said, that's what made the picture clear. And so the timing with that was perfect. Yes, I did a lot of good stuff. The book was good. Bob Orderman was an amazing partner. The kind of funny intellectual thing is the math part, the intellectual part, just doing some revising. Thanks to that thesis advisor, his name was Gene Webb, all sorts of humanism snuck in the front door, back side door, and I didn't even know it.
Aren't you one of the first to really go deep on this people matter?
Well, Warren, Doug McGregor, Chester Barnard, I will say to our credit, in a quote unquote business book for normal business people, the longest chapter in the book are about the roots and where it came from. So I assure you, we were not climbing a mountain that nobody had ever climbed. It is just for kind of the same sorts of reasons that I just talked about, that people just didn't pay attention to that. And, we had, oh God, I know what I want to say right now, but I can't, but I will anyway. People had made organizations into mechanical things. And I will tell you one tiny little story. In the middle of all this, my parents had no money. I went to Cornell as an engineer. Then we started the Vietnam War, and I ended up in Vietnam as a construction engineer. And, arrive in Vietnam, given a group of people, even though I was 23, to be in charge of. I came back 2 years later and went up to Ithaca. God knows where it came from. Maybe when you come out of a war, you can do that. And walked into the dean's office, and I said, "You screwed me. You gave me every bit of technical training you could. And on the first time I put my feet on the ground in Vietnam, I was suddenly responsible for the lives of 17 people, and I didn't know shit." And I said, "I will never forgive you for that." So that's kind of the way those things happen. I know. Was Warren the youngest officer in Europe? Yeah.
I think so. I think he was 19 when he was a captain, I think.
Oh, unbelievable. 19-year-old captain. Holy moly.
Yeah, he didn't know anything. He didn't know what he was doing.
Cool. Sorry?
He didn't know anything. He says that. He's like, I knew nothing. So he really depended on other people, but they let him,
looking at
gave him what he needed.
Over his life. He knew nothing and he knew everything. No, I mean, it was just something would have to be genetically wrong with you to not be attracted to Warren. Give me a package with that smile on it, and I'll take it now at 81. Thank you very much. He was when I have been doing some stuff lately, collecting quotes and so on, and there's a tough old guy who started Home Depot by the name of Ken Langone, and he has one of my favorite quotes of all. He said, "The two most powerful forces in the universe are a kind word and a thoughtful gesture." And, your father, like some others, could run into something that was truly inappropriate, and he wouldn't make you feel good about yourself, but he would really make you feel you understood yourself. instead of, how in the bloody hell did you ever do it that way, for God's sake? You've got an engineering degree. No, 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 no. It was not, he was totally aware of the problem. He was more worried about it than the other person, but it was, let's look at how we people with body cells and all those sorts of things. So it was totally, I hate to use words like point of attack, but it was a totally different point of organizational attack.
Do you feel like the two of you connected over your service? I remember David Gergen remember Betsy at the International Leadership Association, the annual meeting, he mentioned that every president until Clinton had served in the military. Is that right? And that was a crash course in leadership. So do you feel like you and Dad connected around that history?
I would be shocked if we hadn't, but I'm not sure we ever sat down over a highball and talked about it. But you're 19-year-old and you're fighting the bloody Nazis, for God's sakes. And that was not me. People shot at me and I had bad guys and I was building bridges. But nonetheless, there's got to be a connection. I think that's probably why only about 2 of them left. When you go to a VA place in 2024, you'll still see 2 93-year-olds yucking it up with each other to the extent they can. That's got about 3 days left, but it's really true. I had a cousin who was at D-Day, and I went to meet him, and I'd never met anybody in his part of the family, and flew into LAX for the first time in my life. And the first thing he did is take me to a VA place, and we sat down and started drinking. I didn't write a paper about it, but I smelled and watched what these guys who had been through having somebody shoot at them every day, what it was all about. So I could not give you a list, but I would be shocked if the significance wasn't great. Though, again, back to the luck, and I don't know if there's an analog with Warren, is the 3 most important human beings in my life and my development days were my mother, my first commanding officer at Vietnam. They're the big 2. No, my mother, first commanding officer at Vietnam, and then my thesis advisor at Stanford. Period. Bingo. Incredible. My mother, she was a force of nature. Nobody ever called her anything other than the Evelyn, and truly appropriate. And the other thing she did, by the way, and I don't know Warren's background in this, is I came out with the worst athletic skills ever in the history of a living human body. And so we focused on the head. And I swear to God, my mother had me reading serious stuff she said 4, and that's BS. But it was, I was reading orange covered landmark history books, and I know it was well before the age of 5.
So Tom, I know that right now you're really focused on, again, humanism and extreme humanism. Can you talk about that?
Most important thing, I believe, if you're academic, you should give credit. I wrote a book. It was titled Extreme Humanism, and I had the great pleasure and honor of working with an amazing designer by the name of Nancy Green. And I wrote somewhere in a title or something about organizations should be humanistic. And I got a note back from her, no, it's humanism. And that was the last time I ever used the word humanistic. And you guys know, it sounds like it's not a difference, but it is an enormous difference. And, in reality, it was consistent with everything else that I had done, but it rang a bell. And in a way, unfortunately, given the crap that we're going through right now, but the research all over the world in the United States says only 20% of workers are engaged with their jobs, 80% aren't. And in my naive way, I believe if you had leaders who had been trained by Warren Bennis or Ken Blanchard, they would have had 80% who were engaged in their work and 20 who were not, and the 80% would not be the ones who were out hunting for guns. What I always say when people do about work life, I said, listen, for God's sakes, unless you were born with a silver spoon, you are going to spend 80% of your working hours at work with your peers. And if you piss away that 80%, you pissed away your life. It's not this would be cool. It's for God's sakes. And when people say organizations can't be families, that's crap. There are limits, no doubt of it, but they are. I keep coming back to Warren and Doug, Warren and Doug, Warren and Doug. Doug, I never met him, and he was an intellectual force. But I also had the sense, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that in a way, Doug and your father were joined at the hip, because that's what I think of when I think of the big two folks at the top of the mountain for
So
me.
Dad went to Antioch on the GI Bill after he walked into Germany during 1945 and ended up living there for a few years in the occupation. Then went to Antioch because a 26-year-old from his troop had gone to Antioch. This man didn't survive the war, but he told Dad all about this college called Antioch that had a co-op program like the University of Cincinnati. So Dad ended up going to Antioch, and the president of Antioch was Doug McGregor. When he was moving to MIT, Doug McGregor said, you should come to MIT. And he brought Dad with him to MIT. Dad never would have, he wouldn't have gone to college if it weren't for the GI Bill, right? So, and the co-op program.
Yeah.
So then we actually interviewed Joan Goldsmith, who was married to Doug McGregor's son, Peter McGregor. So we interviewed her last week or a couple weeks ago too.
Oh,
so
wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Should figure out like this web of all these people who Dad was friends with and connected to through different relationships and mentoring and all of that. Yeah. And here's Doug McGregor and Warren Bennis.
Yeah, it's because I remember this chapter that we did on what led to In Search of Excellence, and they were right at the top of that list. There were obviously a few other people, but they were the signature players over the last, whatever it was then, 30, 40 years. It was a long time, and obviously the impact continues until 2024, which is pretty damn amazing.
I was going to say, didn't Warren consider Doug McGregor his biggest mentor?
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I always heard.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So here's a question. If you were going to teach a leadership course today, like this is going to be part of a course, hopefully. First of all, what books of your own would you want us to have in the curriculum? And number two, and kind of maybe more importantly, how would you teach extreme humanism? What would you do in a class? What would the curriculum look like?
Let's go to the last one.
Okay.
And I don't know how I would do this, but I might do it on day one. There is a ton of educational research that says if you're a teacher and you stand in the doorway of your classroom and your kids walk in and you smile, you might say things like, gosh, Betsy, your cold sounds like it's a lot better, and do that kind of a welcoming. Disciplinary problems go down by 40%. Educational attachment goes up by 25%. What excites me is the teeny, weeny little things that are the heart of it. There's a book called Compassionomics, and it's about compassion in healthcare. And again, these are a bunch of tight-ass researchers, and they did this research, and if a doctor looks directly into the patient's eye, and trust me, this is down to the penny, 37 seconds, hospitalization stays go down, complications go down, because you compare that to something I read in the Boston Globe a few years ago. They did a study of nurses, and the nurses all now carry a tablet to the bedside. I mean, to me, the nurses are the most important people in the institution, far better than the doctors. And nurse-patient eye contact had gone down by 80%. And then if I were allowed to use every obscene word that I was able to use, I would say that 90% of what's happening on that damn tablet is financial data. It's not that we need to give Betsy a little increase in her whatever or what have you. And it's tragic.
Wow.
Back to your real question. Demonstrate the insane power of a human touch. And if you do that as a teacher and you integrate it directly, indirectly, I mean, I mean, here's another one. I'm sorry. They're just so crazy that I like them. You go in for a mammogram, and the mammogram is in Boston or Cincinnati or Charlottesville, and it's a Texas in the middle of the night in India or Virginia or somewhere. A radiologist reads it, okay? two states of nature. Nature state number one is on the way in. They say, Kate, we just got to do this for our records. Let me get my iPhone out and take a little picture of you, and we're going to put it at the beginning of the records. And so this doctor who couldn't speak English, who's in the middle of nowhere whatsoever, sees these radiological reports. And at the very beginning, this picture of a woman or a man who's ugly or beautiful, doesn't matter, flies by. Then something like 3 weeks later, they gave the same test to the same doctors with no picture, and the doctors found 80% less problems. The mere fact that the real Betsy Myers or the real Kate Bennis had just flicked before your eyes changes the entire universe. And
that
so
fascinating.
in a way, I'm willing to teach a 100-week-old course, and I might even just do 150 experiments like that. People matter.
And then what's wonderful about the program at Cincinnati is that then these kids are going into the workplace all the time because they're doing co-op program, and they're getting a chance to use it in a real place, not in an abstract idea.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. My nephew just graduated as a mechanical engineer from Northeastern, and so he went through the co-op, and I am so desperately in love with co-op programs I can't see straight.
Yeah, they're amazing and effective, and
so the usual.
Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah, totally.
Amazing when you have an amazing teacher. That's always the case. I remember reading.
How would you teach this? So, how would you teach this? By using case studies, or but when you think about if a huge piece of this curriculum was on this aspect of humanism?
Get them out in the field. My mother made me a history buff, and in the 10th grade, I took a history course, and since I was within 100 miles of Gettysburg, that focused on the Civil War, and Mr. Chapin, whose name I still remember, who was the teacher, took the whole class up to Gettysburg to wander around for 3 days. My entire view of the history of anything was flipped upside down. But I think somehow, Betsy, you can get that intimacy into pretty much any course, and everything that's happened so far may be wiped out by AI, before the time the sun sets, but that's a different conversation. But wouldn't it be cool, Kate, Charlottesville, wherever, if you could find some humanistic AI person who could talk about Warren, humans, even in this advanced age? I'd love to see that.
I wonder if this is at odds with AI in a way.
The whole world may come to an end, but for the next 20 years, for God's sakes. But the planet's not going to turn upside down on a dime. I take my chances on standing under the doorway and talking to and saying, "Good morning, Betsy. How are you?"
Yeah.
I'll take that for several more years.
Yeah.
I am more than willing to believe that the odds are 99.9% that I'm totally full of crap when I say that, but there it is.
I'm curious of the evolution of your work, Tom, from your book in 1882, In Search of Excellence, to your last book, Radical Humanism. Right? You said to me once, and it stayed with me, that authors write the same book over and over again, right? Just with some new thinking. So talk about that, because it's such an interesting thing of where we come to now.
Right. I will say, to your first point, I have said in 2023, I am a greedy SOB like everybody else, and I dearly wish you would buy all 20 of my books, and I'll enjoy cashing the royalty check. But to tell you the honest truth, if you read just one of them, I say the same damn thing 19 times again. Put the right kind of microscope on, there's an awful lot of truth to that. The most, and I will get back to your question there, I hate things like this because it's baloney, but it isn't entirely. There was a magic moment in the research for In Search of Excellence in my life that occurred over the course of 2 hours one morning in Palo Alto, California. I was at Stanford, so I was in Palo Alto, and Bob and I were at McKinsey in San Francisco, and we were hunting for companies, and we heard about this kind of mid-sized company that was supposed to be cool, and it was called Hewlett Packard. And so we made a contact and went down to CHP and sorry, to SEEHP. It began when the president came out to greet us at the reception desk, at which point Bob and I both keeled over by heart attacks. So we're in Mr. Young's office, presidential office, $1 billion company, which has little plastic wall dividers on it, and that's the whole thing. Somewhere in the conversation, he said, "There's this thing we call the HP way, and it's really our Bible." And he said, the centerpiece of it is something that we call MBWA, managing by wandering around. Mm. This is no BS. My life flipped. But back to everything we've been talking about for the last few minutes, and Warren, it puts the human being in. This is an engineering company. And yet John takes us out on the shop floor, and there are a bunch of 26 and 27 and 28-year engineers huddled over big computer terminals. It was that at the time. And he seems to know every damn one of them by name. There is zero formality. And it's silly when you say things like this, but in retrospect, when you put together a timeline, everything was different from that day on. Leadership did not have to be some mechanical effing act that was driven mainly by taking accounting courses and taking marketing courses and building systems that were too complicated for any human being to be involved in. So the change came before things started. There was a day in 1996, I had an office in a company in Palo Alto, and the woman who was president of the company came up to me. I was feeling really cool, by the way. She had a child, and I promoted her to president while she was out on maternity leave. Anyway, so she came up to me and she said, and I was busier now, she said, "We're going to Boston next week." I said, "Excuse me? We're going to Boston next week. There's some people who want to talk to you." And so she drags me up to Boston. We go into this woman's conference room. Heather has gathered together 15 leaders, all women. There were people like the woman who started what was then a big deal company, Domain Home Fashions. There was the first woman Indy 500 driver. And she said, "We are here. You are to keep your mouth shut for the next 3 hours. And we are here to teach you just a little bit about reality." And so, honest to God, for 3 hours, I remember this one woman, she had a horrible back problem. And she, goes into a meeting that's involved in maybe the pre-surgery or something. There's the doctor. There's the woman. There's her husband. They're having a 15-minute conversation. 10 minutes in, she turns to the doctor and said, "Maybe it would help if you looked at me because I'm the one who has the problem." And you two know exactly what I'm saying. But it was another one of those things like MBWA. My life was never the same again. I don't think terribly highly of men. And here's why. I bet you neither one of you have heard this quote. "Men I find to be a sort of beings very badly constructed, as they are generally more easily provoked than reconciled, more disposed to do mischief to each other than to make reparation," and on it goes. And are you interested in the author?
Yes.
Benjamin Franklin.
I love that.
Honest to God, it's not attractive at any age to be peeing your pants, but I'm honest to God, think I peed my pants when I read that one.
Wow.
But anyway, the whole point thing is, that, and you both know this, and Betsy and I worked on it and so on. I'm just completely mesmerized by the power of women and by the grotesque stupidity of not taking advantage of it. And it came from a lot of things. It came from my mother, who was a power figure, for God's sakes. Don't F with Evelyn. She gave me other things. I was, as I said, a crappy athlete, so she had me reading from the age of 18 months. And so I became an intellectual, certainly by the age of 3, and that didn't hurt.
So was that conversation in 96 in Boston with Domain? Was that with all women, the woman CEO, who was, her name was Judy?
Well, women CEOs or people like the woman whose name I've forgotten, who was the Indy 500 driver. They were people of substance. All people are something. some were entrepreneurs, some ran a nonprofit, some were school principals or what have you. But yeah, they were a remarkable, unremarkable, meaning a normal set of circumstances, a remarkable set of women, period. And I was top 10 stupid moments of your life. And I really felt like an idiot.
Like you've just
And
been like, wow, like all of a sudden you realize the power or the force of women as leaders.
yeah, and Betsy, I will say, which I have said when I was giving a lot of speeches and had a lot of males in my programs, I would say, listen, I'm going to talk to you about women as effective leaders. I do not have a teeny sense of social justice. We are not doing this for reasons of social justice. We are doing this so we can develop our people, build greater products, serve our customers better. I hope you do have a sense of social justice, but that ain't what I'm selling. I'm selling a million pieces of research that say you put women in charge and better things happen, period. And then, of course, I always go back to my statistical training and say it's all a bell-shaped curve. There are great women and awful women and great men and awful men and great women. But down there in the middle of that normal distribution is, gross a big word, very significant difference in measurable effectiveness. Mm. And it was just, again, just like this other thing. It was Heather comes and says, get your buddy butt up to Boston next week. And it was a total surprise times 10. Mm. And then I kept on meeting people. It was this Betsy Myers woman.
And
one of my favorite Betsy Myers isms was she came to little teeny weeny when she was running the Obama campaign.
I wasn't running it.
You were the COO. Yeah. When Betsy was running the Obama campaign, she came up to little teeny itty bitty Manchester, Vermont, where I was. And then I have forgotten exactly where she was going, but she was going to another Vermont city for another one. And she let me drive her there.
You drove me like an hour.
Yes. See Betsy Myers.
That was really fun. That was 2008.
Well, I once knew somebody who knew President Obama very well. I said, if you ever have a moment, which is a spare moment, you tell him that I got him elected. I gave a speech in Atlanta the Friday before the election. And driving back to the airport in Atlanta, I told my driver to stop by Ebenezer Baptist Church. And so I went into Dr. King's church and said a prayer for Mr. Obama to win. He won.
See, there you
I tipped it. I tipped the scales. You had an incredible experience, and this has nothing to do really with the awful stuff going around now. Mr. Obama, President Obama, was an extraordinary human being and put an extraordinary different look on the planet Earth. And so just amazing. It was so great.
Very historical time.
Yeah. One other little Betsyism, which is only indirect. There's this incredible group that invented airplanes from Lockheed that was called the Skunk Works down in Southern California. And the guy who started it, I thought he was God and so on and so forth, and wrote a lot about him. And then I went to the Warren thing at the Kennedy School, and I ended up with Betsy's parents at their table, and I got to touch the hem of somebody who was on Kelly Johnson's team. That's cool.
Yeah. I know. My dad was a Skunk Works guy. He had read In Search of Excellence. And so, but when my dad had the opportunity to meet and sit next to Tom at the Warren's dinner, like it was incredible. My dad was so excited. Yeah, because he'd been an evangelist of your In Search of Excellence.
Yeah.
Because you studied Skunk Works.
Oh, absolutely. And
yeah.
And we studied for a funny reason, which is the story of the book, because we were doing stuff with a then incredibly awesome company called Xerox in Rochester, New York. And we heard there's some damn group that's inventing more stuff than other work groups, and something's got to be wacky with them. They call them the Skunk Works. So I went up and met the guy who ran it. It was a little 20-person group, and that was my introduction. And then the legend of Kelly Johnson. There are a million ways to say it, but he built these great planes like the spy planes, the SR-71, and so on. The way people summarize it, which is not exact, is they said he was able to do in 1/4 of the time with 250 people what it took Lockheed 5,000 people to do over a 7-year period. And numbers like that are obviously exaggerated, but they are directionally very correct. And I still haven't washed the shirt that I was wearing that night at Warren's event.
Well,
my Johnson patch on it.
Right?
Anyway,
Hey, so Tom, can I ask you, what do you think that, well, first I want to hear from you, but also what you think Dad might want for leaders today? What would he be saying about what we need for leaders and leadership? How can we, yeah, call on his wisdom?
one real answer to that. I would give my left and right arms to know the. I talked about that 80-20 thing and so on. I know he wouldn't be sitting on his butt. And by what he does, was a political activist. I think he would, which is my view, and Kate, tell me if I'm wrong. I think he would find some way to get into the heads of leaders, and maybe it would help at the margin.
Yeah.
I mean, Susan dramatically and me undramatically are involved in some of these things associated with getting the vote out. And some of them, which I laughed at first, like sending postcards with shitty handwriting on them to somebody saying, get out the vote. And then I read the story, and the story is you had some million envelopes and you're yawning. It changes the vote by 3%, which is the difference between winning and losing in,
Wow.
100 votes contests. So,
Well,
I think he understood indirection as well as any human being in the earth. You don't beat him over the head with an axe. You get inside and you make them feel and taste and smell what could be different. And I refuse to be recorded in public as saying things would change dramatically. This is the 82nd year of my life, and I am fearful it'll be the least enjoyable of the 82. Don't say that in public. I mean, I do say it in public. I pray it's not. But he would be, and you tell me, Kate, he would be a Warren type activist, which would be influencing people in substantial groups of significance and influence in infinitesimally small ways. It was what I read Warren's books. I thought they were fantastic. It was his body odor that was important. Strange way to put it, but it was the innards. I mean, this wasn't to him. This wasn't an incredibly great idea. This was, for heaven's sakes, we can make these schools into something else. We can transform the University of Cincinnati, and the whole world hasn't flipped upside down. But the reason we're all gathered here together today is indirect Warrenism, and not very indirect. And so he couldn't have flipped anything, and because I refuse to get sucked into comments like that, but it would have made a difference.
So it sounds like influencing I love what you said about the postcards, because it reminds me of the managing while walking around. Once again, it's about simply human beings contacting human beings, right? And if he had an influence on groups or people, it would be to do what differently, right? That's the question. Like, what would he say? What would his influence nudge them towards in these infinitesimal actions?
To give a completely useless answer, I think back to MBWA or standing in the doorway. I think if every manager in the land started the morning with a wander and how you doing, Betsy? If you could get 200,000 managers to do that, or maybe 2 million. We did this PBS show, and one of the people who started it was a factory manager by the name of whatever her name was, I've forgotten now. And it was in an auto parts factory out in the Middle West. And we arrived with a camera crew and so on. And she took us on a tour. And then in the middle of the tour, we went back we were invited in to see the union leader's office, because, that plant with a lot of people, there's a specific office, there's the union leader's office. We got in and we got chatting. And she was a Betsy too, actually. They all are the good ones. And we got chatting, and she said, the funniest thing, he said, the first day I was here, I knocked on the door and walked into the union boss's office, and we had a chat. No, I heard this from him, actually. And she came in and chatted with me. He said, I've been in this plant 25 years. No boss has ever walked into my office. I am called into the boss's office. He said, you don't know me. You may think I'm a bullshit artist, but I'm telling you, in 25 years, no boss walked into my office. I mean, I think that kind of stuff is the basis of revolution. What your father did far more than maybe McGregor, certainly than Drucker, was indirect. The words were great. The ideas were fantastic. The all-important last 2%. It was the body odor. It was how that connection smelled.
There's the little things, like going into someone's office, which is a big thing, right?
That's that two most important things in the human are a kind word and a thoughtful gesture.
Yes.
It reminds me of him calling you, right? He called you out of the blue.
Yeah, absolutely.
The boss walked into
Absolutely.
the office out of the blue. So there's something about taking action and being really proactive. I mean, Dad always said leaders have a bias for action. So rather than talking and reading the books and talking about it is great, but he took action as well. He made a real connection with people. He wrote handwritten thank you cards. He, managed his life by wandering around. So I think you're right. There's something about just this connection between individual and individual and individual.
Wrote a little bit of his old book on the former president, CEO of Campbell Soup. And the memorable phrase was, in 10 years as CEO of Campbell Soup, he sent 30,000 handwritten notes out to employees at all levels.
Tom, we interviewed
That's
him.
the way this stuff works. Okay, so I'm doing something at 3M, and I'm in the office of a guy by the name of Tate Elder, who's a division general manager, and he's at a retirement party, and he took me into his office, and on the office is a little framed picture, and it was a framed picture of a thank you note that his boss had sent him 20 years ago. And I am well aware of how much that sounds like bullshit, but I'm willing to. I will not bet the farm, but I certainly will bet a few acres. I knew him. He was a great guy, the most understated guy in the world.
So Tom, as Betsy was saying, we interviewed Doug Conant, who wrote that book, who was.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Great. How'd you like it?
Oh,
fantastic.
Yeah. And I ended up having lunch with him in DC. I was there. He lives in like 3 different places. And it was a last minute thing. I reached out and said, any chance you're in town for lunch tomorrow? And he was like, yes and yes. So that's how so he's going to be part of this Bennis Council. And we interviewed him. He said he single-handedly thinks he turned Campbell Soup around by writing those thank you notes.
Well, I will tell you, hand me a Bible or a Koran or the book of your choice, and I will attest to my complete agreement with him. There's no issue. I was in your rarefied world, Betsy, for 18 months, namely the White House, and in a little department dealing with drug abuse. And I had this fantastic boss by the name of Walter Minnick. And we'd get in the office at 4 a.m. We work our ass off. And before the sunset, every day, Walter would disappear. And Walter, every night, wrote 8 or 10 thank you notes to people who had helped him that day. And as you know, Betsy, better than me and Kate, they weren't to congressmen. They were to the legislative aide, AA, who is the last person to put the piece of paper in the congressman's hand before he goes out on the floor. And it's that same thing. We're not talking about some of the charmers today, but in that different world. Well, that world, the same damn thing. And it's a joke line that people use, but it was true because I spent a fair amount of this time, not your kind of time, but on Capitol Hill. And the stories people would say is they would say, Betsy and Tom were on the floor of the House. And I never heard two people swear so hard at each other about something they disagreed with. And then they went to the bar next to Capitol Hill and sat down, had a drink together and resolved whatever. And that was 10 times better than 9. That was the way it used to work. And some guy in an article said, which is obviously simplistic, he said, everything changed when cable TV came along because you now had 535 stars of their own reality show. And they didn't have time to talk to anybody except themselves. I'm getting to the blow line, guys. So
right.
ask me some incredibly profound final question, and I will say nothing
Betsy,
significant.
Betsy, it's on you. Which one of your books should we include in the curriculum if you could choose just one?
The next to last one.
Humanism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.